Hi, and welcome to another in my series of videos on the Gospel of John. In this video, we're going to be asking, when did John write his book? If this is a second edition of John's own writing, when was this second edition written down? Most scholars would say it was composed sometime between 80 and 100 CE, maybe with 110 CE being suggested at times as the latest conceivable date. On the one hand, that makes the fourth gospel a witness to first-generation Christian teaching, even if it came at the very end of that first generation. On the other hand, some will ask, why so late? Again, this is due in part to the fact that we're dealing with a document edited by John's students. That would most likely happen after John's death. In fact, the very last episode added before the editor's conclusion suggests that John's death was a recent event. Earlier in chapter 21, we see the moving scene of Peter's reconciliation with Jesus. The Master affirms Peter's place as a leader of the new community, even though he's denied any connection with Jesus short days before. At the end of this scene, Jesus adds a cryptic prediction of Peter's violent death as a martyr for the new movement. Peter then asks whether the beloved disciple will face the same violent end, and Jesus responds, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you?" The editors of John's Gospel then explain, "So the rumor spread in the community that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but, 'If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you?'" Why end on this anticlimactic note? It would seem that John has recently died, and that some people have been disappointed. Tragically so. They expected John to live until Jesus' triumphant return with the general resurrection of the dead. So the gospel editors close their revised vision with an apologetic clarification. Jesus never actually promised that John would avoid death. He just refused to answer Peter's question. All of this, though, suggests that John is dead already when this gospel was being revised, although probably not dead for long enough for this note of disappointment to have faded yet. Peter, of course, died earlier under Emperor Nero, sometime between 64 and 68 CE. John is remembered by the Church Fathers as having lived into an old age, but if he was a young working man in 30 CE when Jesus died, and if he was at least 70 at his death, that would put John's death no earlier than 70 CE, and probably significantly later. So John's students would be revising this posthumous edition of the Gospel no earlier than about 80. The latest we can plausibly date the revised version is around 100 CE. Why? Well, we have a small fragment of John's Gospel, manuscript P52, that was copied in Egypt sometime before 150 CE. It may have been copied as early as 120 or 130 CE. And the copy would not have been made in Egypt immediately after the book was edited. Putting all of this evidence together, we can be fairly confident that our version of John's Gospel was finished sometime between around 85 and 100 CE. And this almost certainly makes it the latest of our four canonical Gospels. When then would John have written his original version? We don't really know. The book does offer a sophisticated, highly developed reflection on Jesus' identity, so it would likely date from later in John's teaching career, after that teaching had matured. There continues to be debate about whether John knows and responds to the other Gospels, but if he does, then his first edition couldn't have been made long before his death. Matthew and Luke, after all, were composed between the mid-70s and mid-80s CE. So John most likely composed his first edition in the late 80s or early 90s, shortly before his death. Before it could be distributed in its original form then, John must have died, and his original students edited the book for wide distribution. That's why we have no surviving copies of any first edition. It's the students' revision that was shared with the other churches. This means that John's Gospel reflects the mature thinking of one of Jesus' closest disciples. After 50 years or so of thinking about what he had seen and heard, John has arrived at conclusions about his teacher that would hardly have been clear at the time. Those insights have doubtless been fueled by the kind of experiences in worship that clearly helped to shape early Christian faith in Jesus. Experiences that the first believers in Christ understood as encounters with the spiritual presence of the risen Jesus. Nevertheless, what John's students passed on were the memories and reflections of a man who had in his youth walked and talked and sweated with the human Jesus. This was the beloved disciple who had leaned against his teacher on that last fateful night in Jerusalem. At the end of his life, that beloved disciple finally trusted his interpretation of Jesus to ink and papyrus, so that his community would never forget what he had seen and heard, but would continue to believe. Thanks for watching. I'm Ian Scott, and I'm Associate Professor of New Testament at Tyndale Seminary in Toronto, Canada. If you enjoyed this video, take a moment to click the like button and think about subscribing to my channel.